the Oklahoma Sooners. They
Yikes.
just got absolutely crushed against the Texas Longhorns at Red River Showdown, 49 to nothing. Quinn Ewers returns against the Sooners. He strolled. I mean, he looked like he was just on a Saturday stroll. He he looks really good. Don't get me wrong. Really makes me wonder again if he played that full game against Alabama, if Texas could have did something.
Mm.
They would if you would have played against Texas Tech. Are we looking at an undefeated Texas team if Quinn Ewers is still there? Because he has that offense under control. When you look at how he just faced against a Brent Venables defense, I'm not sure if that's something we can say in positive light for that much longer, if ever anymore. But Quinn Ewers looked very good in this football game. Before we really dig into this one, obviously Dylan Gabriel was out of it. He was not in this football game. Oklahoma still looked dreadful though. Even though that the quarterback, he did not look good. The defense was awful. This type of beating is inexcusable. Steve, take me through this game and your thoughts before we really dive in to where we thought went wrong.
If you're Oklahoma, you cannot get drubbed like this in this game. I mean, yes, I mean Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, that might be another game you really need to have at least show up and pretend that you're excited about playing that game, but not the Red River rivalry, not against Texas. I mean, and I realize, it's not what it used to be, but nothing is what it used to be in college football anymore, or college sports in general. Oklahoma just didn't seem to be trying. I mean, and that's terrible to say because I'm sure the kids were out there doing their best, but they were just completely overmatched. And in every aspect of the game, they were overmatched. And for an Oklahoma team to come out like that, it's hard to make me speechless, but I'm almost there because I don't understand what is happening. I mean, I really was high in Oklahoma. I thought they were going to win the Big 12. Right now, I mean, they're going to have to battle with West Virginia to not finish last in the Big 12.
You took the words right out of my mouth on that one. I honestly think that that might be the case. Brent Venables is in a predicament. I think that there might be a panic level that might be unreachable at this moment. I know that he's in year one, but this is a different kind of program. You need to succeed right away, especially when Lincoln Riley leaves with short notice. He left to go to USC, so right away Oklahoma had to fill the shoes of Lincoln Riley with someone who needed to be successful right away. Now, was that mean that did that mean that they had to be an 11-win, 10-win football team? Not necessarily, but they needed to battle into November and December, at least November, Steve, for the Big 12. And that seems like that's not happening at the beginning of October. This is rough. This is a really tough time for Brent Venables. If I'm a Sooners fan, I want to say stay patient. That's what I want to say, but I would not blame you after these last three games because these games aren't close.
No.
Kansas State game, okay, fine. We might see that there's a kryptonite kind of scenario in there. I can take that one. The first loss under Venables, great. Next week against TCU. Now TCU is a good football team. We've seen that the last couple of weeks. But come on, Steve. Come on. I mean, and then obviously
I
the Red
hear you.
River Showdown is not anything way that Red River has been in the past. This was two unranked teams. This was not a college game day. This wasn't even a top-notch broadcast game to watch at noon Eastern time. This was like fourth on the slate if you really wanted to pay attention, and that should never be the case when Red River's happening. And then people stopped tuning in after the second quarter because Oklahoma was down 28 nothing. I think in the middle of the second. I feel worse for the marching band of Oklahoma than I do Oklahoma because they had to stand there and not play a single play, and then Texas got to use their symbols more often, seven times. What is your thoughts on Venable? Should Oklahoma panic? I think there's a reasonable thought now that you should.
No, I don't think that you should panic. One thing, and you alluded to it, Lincoln Riley leaving kind of abruptly. I mean, his name was out there to go to USC, but you have to wonder if Lincoln Riley, when he was kind of mulling things over, he was looking at this last batch of recruits, how they were developing, and maybe he knew in the back of his mind, maybe we don't have the recruiting depth that we thought that we did. As far as Venables goes, he's now coaching with Lincoln Riley's players. On the defensive side of the ball, Lincoln Riley has always, and again, there's been a lot of that Olay stuff with Oklahoma defense through the years, uh, through the Lincoln Riley years at least.
Mm-hmm.
He went with the athletic talent, the guys that could make potentially a big play, those kind of athletes. Whereas Venables coming out of Clemson, they recruited guys that were technically skilled as well as athletic, and that's why Clemson defenses have always been that good. They've had that particular kind of player that fit the defensive schemes that they were putting out there. Now again, the SEC, I mean the SEC, the ACC does not have the amount of wide open offenses that the Big 12 has. But I think really you have to give him this year to see who they can bring in the transfer portal, because now you would think, oh my, this is going to hurt people wanting to go to Oklahoma. There are players that are going to go into this transfer portal and say, I can make a difference right away at one of the premier programs in the country. So it actually might benefit him. I mean, if Oklahoma was really good, and you have to think about, gee, do I want to go to Oklahoma? Do I want to go to, I don't know, Nebraska or whatever, where I have more chance to play? Everybody's going to have a chance to play in Oklahoma. And I think Venables is going to do that here. I think the rest of the year, he's playing with house money. He might as well start bringing in some younger guys, bring up some second stringers to see what they do with the first string. So panic time? No. I mean, are Oklahoma fans panicking? Yes. I mean, I have a very, very dear close friend whose boyfriend and fiance was a diehard Oklahoma fan until 2 weeks ago. And now suddenly goes, I don't care about Oklahoma anymore. I'm going to root for whoever. I think he's rooting for Penn State or Pitt or some local school. I mean, that's how a big part of the fan base might be feeling now. But it's still a dream job for any college coach. It's still a destination for players. It'll work out. I mean, you're going to have a bad year once in a while.
I have seen some interesting social media too. I've seen some people say, I'm just going to take a year off for Oklahoma. They'll be back next year. So you're going to not pay attention to them? Like, I don't know. Not going to question people's fanhood on this podcast. But I will say that it is difficult, especially in big schools like Oklahoma. You know, you see it with, other big name schools that usually sit in the top 10. I mean, Oklahoma was 6th at the beginning of the season for preseason. But at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of a coaching regime, it's hard to brush off first impressions. It is very difficult to do so. We've seen that. The first one that pops to my mind is Rodriguez from Michigan. Okay, that was a pretty rough first impression. I can probably spit out a few other ones. I think maybe the only one that has really successfully helped themselves after a bad first impression might be Dave Miranda. Now, Brent Venables could be that person. We saw him succeed in Clemson as a defensive mastermind. And you're right. He does not have his recruits. Now, he might have more of his team than a prior first season coach might have because of the transfer portal, but still not enough. Still not enough. This isn't a situation where you're in year 3, year 4, and you are starting to have your recruits, your team, your system intact. Oklahoma was set to have a mediocre season after an abrupt leaving of Lincoln Riley. Brent Venables was put in a rough situation. Hopefully the athletic director of Oklahoma understands that and doesn't take the heat from the boosters and the crowd and the fans and decide to push Venables out of the way. Because as we said last week, because unfortunately we talked about Oklahoma as bad as they were last week, if you send Venables out, you're right in the same back position as you are right now. Year 1. With that being said, though, Steve, Brent Venables was a defensive coordinator for Clemson. Probably for the last 6 to 8 years, we could say he was probably the best defensive coordinator in college football. I feel like you could make that argument. There's probably going to be some that pops up here and there, but I feel like it's very easy to make the argument that Venables is in that conversation for at least for a good part of the last decade. What I'm getting at is that once they take that next step to head coach under the Dabo Swinney coaching tree, it doesn't really seem to work out. Now, the panel's still out on Brent Venables, who right now is winless in the Big 12, Tony Elliott, the head coach of UVA, who is currently winless in the ACC. But let's look at Jeff Scott. He's at USF, 4-22. Chad Morris had probably the worst coaching record in SEC history, basically, with his run at 4-22, or I'm sorry, 4-18 at Arkansas. I know you have some strong thoughts about this, so I want to hear. But what's your thoughts about the success of a Dabo Swinney coaching tree once they leave Clemson?
There's no such thing as a coaching tree. It's like analytics. It's like expected whatever in whatever analytics you use for sports. It's what happens on the field. It's not what's expected. When you come out of a system, and we already talked about, you're inheriting the existing players, the existing recruiting classes. You have 1 year basically that you have to try to figure out who's who, get the most out of whatever. You also have to factor in to the equation. Many of the coaches you just mentioned went to programs that were in trouble, and they were in deep trouble. UVA was in deep trouble. USF, I mean, they did a great job creating that program, but they really haven't been relevant, for a very long time. I mean, UCF surpassed them, and everybody thought USF, that was going to be the next big Florida powerhouse. It's never played out that way. And that's the key phrase, played out. It's not Dabo Swinney's fault that these guys are not succeeding. And even though you might come out of a program and you're taking things from that program, if you don't have the same caliber players and you don't have, I guess, the history of excellence in your program, it doesn't matter what worked in Clemson. Clemson is going to be among the top 5 recruiting schools in the nation year in, year out. It's a destination now. So you're not going to get those guys at UVA. Arkansas, that I couldn't figure that one out. I think that's just a matter of, and I didn't watch enough Arkansas football to say definitively this is it. I think maybe he could have taken more from the Clemson schemes and applied them at Arkansas. At Oklahoma, it is a destination program. This is like an outlier year. Now, next year, if they're still struggling, I'm not saying they're going to have to win 10, 11 games next year, right, but Oklahoma's getting ready to move on to an even bigger challenge. There has to be some significant signs of improvement. And I think of all of the coaches in this alleged tree, Venables is the guy that can make it work.
Is there an opportunity, or is there a scenario that Brett Venables doesn't make it through this season?
Well, the way this season's going, it's, who knows?
Right. So they're currently 3-3.
Yeah, I mean, you've heard talk of like Jimbo Fisher, who has a $95 million buyout. Everybody's like, that's okay. That's fine. We'll pay him $95 million. So that's how much money is pouring in to these Power 5 conference schools now. So, I mean, if you could just shrug off $95 million, that's fine.
You're going to think that Oklahoma's going to want to get it right before they head to the SEC, too. So it'll be really interesting to think if they think Venables is the guy.
They need to be headed in the right direction. Don't waste your ammunition now in a bad year. Wait, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens in the transfer portal. Let's see what happens in spring practices. And, we don't really get to see a lot of what happens in spring practices, but that really determines for a lot of ADs and for a lot of boosters, because those boosters are going to these spring practices. They're not supposed to be there, but they get in. If there's enough checks in that checkbook, you're getting into whatever practice you want to get into. It would be a mistake for Oklahoma after 1 year, because then all they're doing is they're going back. They're going in negative. They're not even back to square one. They're like in -2 square. Having to wait, and go from there. So no, if he gets fired, then Oklahoma becomes irrelevant for the next 5 to 6 years, especially going into the SEC.
I think you make a valid point. I really do. I think they need to find a way to solidify around him, give him a chance. He knows how to recruit on the trail. We've seen that in Clemson for almost the last decade, and we need to give him an opportunity to do so. I absolutely agree. I just wonder if we are the majority. That's what I'm curious about. That's why these topics keep coming up. They are currently 3-3. As of the records sit right now, the rest of the 6 games that they play, they only play one losing record team right now, and that's West Virginia at 2-3. They go in and they have to play. They host Kansas next week. Kansas coming off a tough loss at TCU. That's gonna be tough. Then Iowa State, then Baylor, then they go against West Virginia, as I mentioned, and then end the season against Oklahoma State and Texas Tech. That's a tough rest of the schedule because we know how deep the Big 12 is. I don't see them being eligible for a bowl this year.
I don't either. And they're playing West Virginia at West Virginia. I mean, West Virginia, even when they're in a down cycle like they are now, I mean, they've had all kind of just horrific injuries, but at home, later in the season, that might even be West Virginia. No, I think West Virginia has one other home game after Oklahoma, but still, that's the big ticket. That's the
Mm-hmm.
ticket you still can't get. Even with Oklahoma struggling, you still can't get a ticket without paying an exorbitant amount of money. They could lose on the road to West Virginia.
Yeah, I agree. Assuming that they can win that game, I think the absolute ceiling for this team is 6-6 this year. They'll just make a bowl, but that's giving them maybe one of these wins that I think is going to be tough. I think based on scoring, if Dylan Gabriel's back, I think they can beat Iowa State. I think that could happen. I think that they could beat West Virginia, and then I think you got to find a win somewhere else to make 6. I think 5-7 is where I'm sitting at Oklahoma right now. You look at the rest of the schedule at 5-7, and that would be what, one win in the Big 12 for Brent Venables in his first year, maybe two against Iowa State and West Virginia. There's going to cause a lot of stirs in the offseason for the Sooners crowd, without question.